The following podcast was produced by Big Head Amusements for KQEK.com. Beginning as a songwriter and moving into film scoring in 1996, Michael Penn is best known for scoring P.T. Anderson's Hard Eight and Boogie Nights. He's also scored the hit TV series Girls and Showtime's Masters of Sex, set during the sleek and stylish late 50s and early 60s. For the latter series, Penn incorporated sounds from the iconic Novachord, a progenitor of tube-based synthesizers that could somewhat emulate an assortment of organ and orchestral instruments. Penn's familiarity and use of vintage and affectionately arcane keyboard instruments include the Chamberlin, a similarly unique instrument where the sounds of an orchestra could be performed via samples recorded on tape loops and accessed by a standard keyboard. Our discussion begins with the Chamberlin and its European cousin, the Mellotron, instruments that, in addition to extensive interviews with Penn himself, appeared in the excellent documentary Mellodrama, the Mellotron Movie. It's actually an interesting coincidence because I just finished watching a documentary on the Mellotron.
Oh, yeah, right.
The documentary itself was fascinating because of the way that instrument was designed and the unique sounds that it made. But when I looked up the Novachord and learned some details of how it worked and then actually heard some samples, I was really stunned at the sounds that it produced and how contemporary that they are.
I know, right? I know. It's really interesting.
Why don't we just begin with how you got involved with Masters of Sex, because it's a really interesting series in terms of its period, in addition to also being an amazingly written show.
I got involved because the producer, writer, showrunner, creator, Michelle Ashford, had heard my work on Girls, and called me in to meet on the show, and we discussed it and talked about possible things, and I guess she felt that I'd be a good match for the show.
Were there any early consultations in terms of the sound that they wanted, or did they ask you for any ideas in advance?
Well, we talked about it and initially, and basically the things that I was talking about, because television today, if it's not network TV, you're not dealing with the same kinds of budgets, and you don't have the same access to, in-house studios and union players that television once had in its heyday and perhaps still does in the network world. So there are budgetary constraints, because immediately when I looked at the show and the rich look of the cinematography and all of that stuff, I mean, it wants to be an orchestra, but there's no money to have an orchestra. So for me, it was kind of creating some kind of somewhat ghostly version of a 1950s recording of an orchestra, which the Chamberlin actually came in very handy for. And then the next piece of it, because if I have a version of an orchestral sound and I have piano, I'm halfway there. But the other piece of it for me in the show was the character of William Masters, who's extremely detached emotionally. And I kind of felt like I wanted there to be some sound of detachment and science that was a part of the score, which leads to synthesizers. But when I initially think of synthesizers, I think of a modern sort of meaning of that. But then, when I went, well, how can I make that appropriate in my mind? It immediately went to the earlier tube-based synthesizers of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And the Novachord was probably the most versatile of all of those.
And then in selecting the Novachord, I mean, I take it you used a genuine instrument. It wasn't a...
I wish. I did not. I used a very deeply sampled set of samples.
Have you ever used an original before?
No. In fact, as far as I know, there are only a couple of even functioning ones in the world. They're very, very tough to maintain and repair. Some of the components of the Novachord that actually determine the pitch of the oscillators, you can't even buy them anymore. So the people who are trying to restore them are sort of mixing and matching new value capacitors to try to get things in tune, and it's a nightmare. So somebody had a working one that a company went and sampled, and so I used that.
Yeah, I was just fascinated by how that instrument was originally designed and it was mass-produced, and I can't imagine what listeners used to traditional jazz orchestras and classical orchestras thought when they first heard the sounds coming from that instrument, because to me, when I hear it, I'm literally listening to a 1970s synthesizer.
Yeah, you're listening to something very otherworldly. I mean, it wasn't like it didn't have precursors. I mean, the Ons Martineau was invented in the 20s, and there were actually classical pieces written for that instrument. But those are monophonic synthesizers. They're only playing a single melodic line. But the Novachord was this giant polyphonic thing that could actually play chords and have multiple sounds at the same time, and it was a very involved. It was thought of as an organ, just using a different technology, but what it essentially is a tube synthesizer.
I was just fascinated by the quantity of gear that's involved in it. And I guess at this stage, it's probably really significant that there are people that still preserve these instruments because it enables you to get authentic samples from that and build a score without having to deal with the perhaps chaotic nature of the instrument or the quirks of it.
That's exactly right.
And then you mentioned that you also use the Chamberlin, which I think you, at least in the documentary, you do own one.
Yes. When I was younger, in my singer-songwriter days, synthesizers were a predominant sound in the 70s and the 80s in pop music, and I was never a fan of synthesizers, and primarily because by that point they were trying to imitate acoustic instruments, and that always bothered me. They weren't just being what they were, and in looking for textures for arrangements and things, that was never something that I went to. But what I did enjoy were the sounds of the Mellotron and the Chamberlin, which are, for those that don't know, it's essentially early sampling, where it's actual tapes that are playing actual notes of actual acoustic instruments playing those notes. So you have a keyboard, and you have, when you press down a key, it's basically pushing a tape against a tape head and a roller, and it's sending it across the tape head, playing that note of whatever instrument patch you have loaded up. So I spent a couple of summers saving money and bought a Chamberlin.
When I found out how the instrument worked from the documentary and they showed it functioning, my jaw dropped just because it's complicated, but then it's not. But at the same time, it's all these moving parts, and it's kind of a miracle that it actually is able to work so well.
Yeah, it's a contraption.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no other word for it.
And I think also what I enjoyed about your interview segments in the documentary is that you were able to articulate sort of the quirks of the instrument as well as the uniqueness of it. And I wonder if part of the attraction in using that instrument, if not maybe some similar ones, is instead of let's say having a keen interest in maybe sort of classical instruments or ethnic instruments, ethnic percussion, some composers, they like to gravitate towards sort of the chunky technological devices that are several decades old but are really unique in the kind of sounds that they make.
Yes. I mean, for me, it's just trying to find textures that appeal to me. And I think one of the things that really appeals to me about the Chamberlin, apart from the fact that it's early sampling as opposed to synthesis imitating something else, is also the fact that unlike a modern sampler where you can get let's just as an example talk about the violin, you can get samples of a violin and they're pristine and they're perfect and they're pitched and they sound perfect, and there's a lack of humanity to that. But the recordings in the Chamberlin and the recordings in the Mellotron as well are flawed, and there's weird little variances of pitch, and there's weird, little bit of grating of the bow that comes in and out, and there's an inconsistency to the sounds. There's an imperfection to the sounds that I think adds tremendously to the humanity of the sound.
And when you were composing the cues for the episodes, for myself, I noticed that it does have a really interesting sound in terms of it's very cool and very sleek. There's sort of light jazz, and there's a couple of tracks that kind of stood out for me. I love the way that you incorporated, for example, some vibes in some of the tracks, and the way that things just sort of, like, acoustically, they just kind of glow.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to keep the palette somewhat rooted in the time period. I felt that doing something too modern would be distracting and a little incoherent. So in thinking about ways to break the score down and give myself some different places to go arrangementally, one of the sets that I put in my brain was a little vibes combo that could serve a lot of functions in addition to the more orchestral parts and the Novachord parts.
And I think also because there's maybe just sort of a slight contemporary sound to the score that sort of helps lead into the end credit music. Each episode ends with a contemporary song, but the song itself has sort of been scaled down. So it has kind of the basic instrumentations of the score, but I think through the singers and the sparse lyrics, it still is very much tied to both the score and what the characters underwent in that particular episode.
Well, yeah, I mean that's true for that episode. The series as a whole varies. I mean, there are some episodes that end with a song. There are some episodes that actually end with a score piece, often an extension of whatever the final score piece is. And that was fun because it allowed me the opportunity to, let the score really breathe and come out even more in those moments.
And did you function as well as a music supervisor on the show?
No, these shows all have a completely separate person to do that sort of thing.
Did you have to work around pre-existing music that they had intended to use, or did you have very specific spots where you were allowed to compose and have leeway to kind of bleed into other scenes?
Yeah, I mean that's the function of where score exists in a show is usually sort of hammered out in what's called a spotting session, where I'm meeting with the showrunner and we're looking at the episode, and they've temped things in, which sometimes I don't want to hear what they've temped in, but at least it serves as a marker for where they hear music. And then there might be a place where I hear music or I disagree and don't think music should be in this spot or whatever. So those things are sort of worked out in the process of scoring. In terms of anything else, there's an episode that is somewhere in the middle where the Virginia character actually sings a song. So in one of those recording booths. So I did the track with Lizzie Kaplan of that cover of that song. But apart from that, it's just been determining the places where score is needed and then finding the right palette.
And then my next to last question is just in regards to the main title music, because I like the way that there's all these different percussion textures, but there's a really fluid flow to the whole thing, and yet at the same time I think it kind of hides the sophistication of the orchestrations in that piece.
Oh, well, thanks. The title, I didn't really know what that was going to be until I saw that the visuals that they had cut together for the title sequence, which for those who haven't seen the show, is this sort of barrage of double entendre visual images having to do with sex. And when I saw it and I saw the pace of it and the flow of it, it just felt like this would be a tango. So that's where I parked myself and got out the accordion.
And then my last question is actually one that a colleague wanted to ask. He's been a huge admirer of your work when you were doing a lot of song albums, and he wanted to know if there's a chance you might have another song album coming in the future.
Man, I hope so. I would love to do that again. I mean, it's a different world, and it would certainly be for the love of it, because there is, unless you're somebody who wants to tour, there's no middle class in that part of the music business anymore. And I have a real desire to write songs and to do that, but I have to have the time to be able to sort of have that luxury, and I hope to. At this point, I keep my toe dipped in that pool a little bit because Lena Dunham has asked me to write the season closing song a couple of times for the show for girls. But in terms of making my own record, that's a hope.
Showtime's original series, Masters of Sex Season 1, is available on Blu-ray and DVD from Sony Pictures Home Entertainment. Mellodrama, the Mellotron Movie, is available from online retailers including bazillionpoints.com. For reviews, further interviews, and additional information, please visit KQEK.com. For podcasting services, including editing and mixing, please visit the Multimedia Skills section at mondomark.com for further information plus media samples. This program is copyrighted 2014 by Mark R. Hassan.
And put it down.